Welcome to Conversations. I'm wearing this shirt for a reason. We're going Caribbean a bit today. My guest is Rafael Chacon. Rafael is Associate Professor of Art History at the university, but for our purpose today, he is Cuban, and that's where we're kind of going to move at least the beginning of the conversation today. Rafael, we were just talking, you had your first 7 years as a Cuban native.
That's right.
What was that?
My family comes from outside of Havana. So it's a small town called Artemisa, which is just in the tobacco country, just outside of the city, the capital city. And I was born in '63, and my family emigrated in 1970.
What did your dad do down there?
Well, let's see. We left in 1970, and at the time, well, there were a few years when he wasn't doing anything because he was under house arrest. So, and before that, a labor camp. But prior to that, he was a mechanic and worked for the Artemisas, the municipal bus depot, as basically ran the shop for this, this small town.
Well, you and I have talked before about all this, and what I find kind of fascinating is the difference in perspectives. I was an American, and I remember the 50s, and it doesn't quite jibe when I talk to you. What did it seem like as a kid? Did you realize that you were in the center of world focus, or?
No, I don't think so. I think those first 7 years of my life in Cuba are, in some ways, seem rather idyllic. It was a wonderful childhood on that island, and then, of course, as my folks decided that they wanted to leave the country and were trying to get out, and my father was sent away to a labor camp. Those years were kind of rough, but I think they buffered me from, protected the kids basically from what was going on politically and what was going on in the greater world. However, having come to the United States in 1970, I think that the fact that I was Cuban, coming from this island with a very special, under very special circumstances, and that the relationship between my homeland and this country has been very tense ever since. I think that there's always been an awareness that that being Cuban is not like being just any immigrant to this country. That there is, in fact, that what happens politically and globally between our two countries has indeed affected my life growing up since then.
What about the Russian presence there? The Russians had moved in. You were well aware of them as a kid,
yes.
I guess is what
yes.
I'm saying.
Well, I don't think I ever met any Russians when I was a child in Cuba, but yes, Russia played an enormous role in the cultural life, the political life of the island in the late 60s and early 70s. Russia was very new and novel then. In fact, I have cousins who have Russian names and distant relatives named Olga and Nikita and Lenin, So my brother, my youngest brother, is named Ivan, and Ivan is not a typical Cuban name, and yet it was in the mid '60s.
Well, that's what kind of fascinates me. Is, you see, we were fed this line that the Russians were evil, horrible people. That was the line in those days. And when I found out from you that, I assumed that the Cubans would think that the Russians were just as evil as we did, and to find out that people were naming their kids Ivan. And were you there when when the Bay of Pigs happened and the missile crisis? And
well, I was born in 1963, so I think I missed those events.
Okay, that's
in fact, my folks were married in '58, which is the year of the Revolution, and this year I did a lecture series, a community lecture series at the university, and Paul Lauren, the historian, introduced me, and he commented that I was born in October of '63, so it would have been a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he said that my parents had to have been the most optimistic people on the planet, which is a very nice thing to say. I think I was born after the rift between Cuba and the United States, and certainly, at the height of the tensest period of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. So it was, I think those early years of my life must have been very, very tense on the island. And of course, there were incidents of sabotage, and in some ways the revolution was ongoing during those early years. On the other hand, they must have been very heady years for my parents and their generation, especially the folks who decided to stay. And one thing I should say is that most of my family, my parents, their parents, and my folks' siblings decided to leave the country right away or during those early years. My father had initially fought on Fidel's side and decided to stay. And it wasn't too long after he made that decision, once practically the entire family had left, that he decided that this was not going to work out. And there were shortages, and there were all kinds of problems on the island, and so I think it was a rough time for them.
For those of us who aren't quite up on all this, maybe between us we can piece together some of this history.
Sure.
Let's go back as far as Spain having Cuba, owning it, and then there was the Maine blowing up, and and then all this turmoil, and America was in there. Well, maybe better if you picked it up.
Sure. Yeah. Cuba and the United States have always had a tense relationship, and in some ways, I was just thinking about this, that there's the best metaphor for Cuba is probably on its own the seal of the nation, which is a coat of arms, and there is a little image at the very top of that shield, and it shows a bay with a gold key in the middle of it. And Cuba, it's been part of Cuba's national identity to see itself as the key to the Caribbean, it's the largest island in the Caribbean. And if one thinks about Cuba's history, it's always been a kind of crossroads. It's a narrow piece of land in the middle of this very important body of water that connects both north and south, and connects the Atlantic to the Pacific, and or at least to the Spanish Main, to Mexico and Central America. And Cuba is right smack in the middle of that piece of land, and so it's a piece of property that has been coveted by all the great powers, the colonial powers. And of course, Spain invested a lot in that island and its port in Havana and its other major ports. And I think in the late 19th century, the United States, along with Manifest Destiny, began to see Cuba as prime real estate. So the United States began to support Cuba's drive for independence. And you have to remember that Cuba, Puerto Rico, and Guam and the Philippines were basically the last of Spain's global territories. And it wasn't until 1898 that Spain lost those last colonies, and Cuba was the last choice piece of real estate in Latin America. The United States played a fundamental role in that by supporting the rebels against Cuban independence, against Cuban the colony, against Spain's dominion in Latin America. Once Spain was gone, then there was this great question, what do we do with Cuba now? And how independent will Cuba be? The United States had promised Cuba its independence, but there were 5 years as a protectorate, and then once independence was granted, the United States made sure that its economic and political interests weren't going to be crossed by this new independent nation.
Well, I believe, now I may be wrong, but that when the peace treaty was negotiated between the United States and Spain, that we, the United States, didn't particularly care about getting the Cubans in on the whole process at all.
That's right. The Cubans were essentially frozen out of their own independence. And there was a liberal, democratic, or Republican form of government established, and a constitution. In fact, the Cuban government, that republic as it was set up, mirrored our own republic in this country. The only problem with that constitution was this thing called the Platt Amendment, which essentially meant that the United States could intervene in Cuba's affairs, nullify any election, if the United States' interests were crossed by the decisions of that republic. So essentially, it was a sham republic. Cuba's independence was no independence at all, because the United States had every right to come in and do as it pleased. So anyway, to sort of make a long story short, that the relationship between the United States and Cuba has been intimate. And for some people that's been good. For a lot of people, especially the Cubans, that's been interventionist. It's been, and I think that it's because of that intimacy that Cubans have such a complicated relationship with the United States, both positive and negative.
Well, and Americans do too. From, as I say, from growing up with all of that, it was Cuba was always there, and I'm old enough to remember the end of all that hysteria about the communists. And just accusing anyone of being a communist was enough to ruin their reputation. For some reason, I don't know why that was. Even as a kid, it was like, why can't they be a communist? But when Castro, after some years after the revolution, said that he was a communist, it sort of confirmed this notion that populist revolutions must be bad things because they might be communist. And here's this guy who finally says, yes, I'm a communist. And it set off a real violent anti-Castro.
That's right. And if you think about the kind of the way that Americans perceived Cuba as, all the way through 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, as a good neighbor, as a place where one could go and have a comfortable vacation and smoke cigars and drink rum and enjoy the carnival. And I think Americans had a warm spot for Cuba during, and of course our histories have been mutual for so many years, and then all of a sudden to have this communist dictatorship right there next, and a thorn in our own side. It was a little like Cuba was to the United States what West Berlin was to the Russians. It was this little island of the enemy right there, and to a certain extent, Cuba was legitimated in its populist revolution because it had so much support from the liberal left, both in this country, in Western Europe, and in Latin America.
Well, you're talking about the key to the Caribbean, and I was thinking that there's another sense in which it's key, and that's ideologically.
Yes.
At least at that time, all of a sudden you have this successful populist revolution right in the key to the Caribbean.
That's right.
And you have Che Guevara, who's running off to various parts of the area, and revolutionary movements are saying, gee, maybe we've got a chance, and America's saying, well, God, we don't want these stable governments to blow up. We have interest there, and it became
and we must have, there was that theory about the domino theory, of course, and Fidel, was, to a certain extent, was emboldened by his popularity throughout Latin America. And I think Americans saw Latin America as a series of dominoes lined up, and if Cuba right next door could fall, then Mexico could be next, and then Brazil could be next, and then this whole, then all of Latin America could in fact become another Soviet bloc right in our own doorstep. It must have been, the fear that Americans had over Cuba must have been intense during that decade.
It was, as I say, I was younger and I wasn't in on all of it, but I remember once I was in kind of a boys' league of the Masonic Lodge, and they had a father-son thing, and they had this movie about the horrible things the communists were doing, and I thought it was kind of strange. I couldn't believe it at the time. It turned out later, some months, that it was a phony movie that right-wing forces had put together to make the communists look even worse than we thought they were.
And Cuba may have, in some ways, been the catalyst for our support of regimes that were intolerable even to Americans. The dictatorships in Latin America, the undemocratic military regimes that took power throughout the 60s, with brutal coups d'etats and brutal suppression, things that Americans themselves would never tolerate here, and yet we tolerated in Latin America because of Cuba's presence and because the fear that what happened to Cuba could in fact happen to all these other neighbors.
Well, but under Batista, the dictator that Castro overthrew, as you were saying, Cuba was wide open. It was a big tourist spot. May not have been that good for the Cubans, but if you were an American who went down there, there was sex, there was drugs, they were partying, Ricky Ricardo and all of that, and it was all very picturesque. And I am sure that a lot of money went down the drain when, a lot of American money went down the drain when Castro did that, and I'm sure there were many people who feared that something similar could happen anywhere in the area.
Well, Castro, I don't know these details very well, but Castro did nationalize. I mean, his government nationalized major American industries. There were Americans and foreigners owned huge portions of the island, prime real estate on the island. All of those lands were nationalized, and so Western Europe and the United States lost a huge portion of that island because of that revolution. Whether, in fact, that was morally justified, nationalizing those things for the Cuban people, that's I'll leave that to the ethicists and the lawyers to decide. But the fact is that Cuba was, and again, I don't really know how prosperous Cuba was prior to that, but there must have been enough social ill, enough problems on that island to generate this revolution and to have so much support from the Cuban people. Now, my folks in their generation, and my family was a middle-class, working-class family, those people were the ones that had the most to lose because they were the small shop owners and the property owners, and those were the people who left the island, when they realized that they were going to be living in a socialist and eventually a communist country.
We talked about the United States and Europe losing out on Cuba. We became so paranoid. We put this embargo around Cuba, which still is in place. But eventually the rest of the Europeans came around and said, well, might as well, play with the government that's there. And so the Europeans have set up decent relationships with Cuba,
Yes.
where we're still holding out.
Yeah. Fidel Castro has survived 8 American presidents, and that's remarkable. And I don't know if this is correct, but apparently he's the longest, the head of state who's been in power for the longest amount of time in the 20th century. I think he's even beaten Francisco Franco's record.
Well, I was thinking about Queen Elizabeth is
Oh,
52. I
maybe.
believe.
Okay. All right.
She's got a year on her, maybe.
Right. Regardless, he's survived. I think he's a tenacious politician who's been able to play the United States. And this embargo, and, I have mixed feelings about the embargo. I understand the rationale for, putting this noose around Cuba and containing Fidel economically. On the other hand, the fact is that everyone trades with Fidel except for us. Americans are able to go anywhere they want on the planet, with the exception of Cuba. The minute you spend $1 on Cuba, you've broken the law, essentially. So I find that really interesting, and I find it sort of bizarre that we will tolerate this scenario. And I don't know to what extent this regime is brutal. You hear it all the time that there's oppression on the island, that dissidence is quelled by Fidel, that he doesn't tolerate political dissidents. The economics of the island have always been in dire straits since the Communist Revolution. People are eking an existence at best. On the other hand, I'm not sure how effective this embargo is in the long run. I think it's been a very effective tool for Fidel to say, look at what this evil North America, the great colossus to the north, is doing to us. And it's legitimated his, keeping the dissidents quiet, keeping himself in power.
If I'm grinning over here, I just remembered, have you ever seen Our Man in Havana?
No.
It's one of those British, Alec Guinness and all those people.
Yeah.
And Ernie Kovacs is playing a Batista figure, the dictator, and this young girl with more body than brains says, well, I know he murders and tortures people, but he's nice to me. I always thought there was an amount of truth in there. It all depends on how many people get hurt and how closely you're related to them. And
I think it's increasingly harder to make the case that this embargo is keeping Cuba. The Cubans call it a blockade. They use the war terminology, but it's harder and harder to make the case that this embargo is in fact making Cubans Democrats. It's making them people who want to overthrow their government. I think the argument that if we drop this embargo and allow American companies to do business and allow Americans to travel freely to that island, the argument that will create an enormous, a wave of democratic aspirations on the island. I think that argument has a lot stronger support these days than it ever has.
Rafael, let me turn this a bit more personal to you,
Sure.
because your parents are here. You still have relatives there, right?
Mm-hmm. Very few, but yes.
So what, I think coming here in 7, you probably see yourself more as an American than a Cuban? Or is that a...
Oh, gosh, I see myself as a hyphenated American.
Well, grant me that for a little
Yes,
bit,
yes,
that you feel more American. How does it feel to be a solid American citizen?
Yes, I voted yesterday.
Yes, which I didn't. I spaced it out. I'm sorry. How does it feel to be a staunch American, taxes, the whole business, well-established member of your community in the country, and yet not be able to go visit relatives and have to go through all of this
Sure.
to visit your country because one administration there is mad at...
That's such a wonderful question. It's an unanswerable question. I feel both Cuban and American. I don't think a day goes by when I don't see myself as a Cuban. That Cuba doesn't somehow enter my thinking. It's an inherent part of my identity. On the other hand, I feel like a fully participating citizen who loves this country, and this is in fact my country. This is my culture. When I go to Miami, I feel like an alien there. I can't completely identify with Cubans who are still very much living either the Cold War or living in Cuba of the 1950s. I don't live in a Cuban community or even a Cuban-American community. I wasn't raised in a Cuban-American community. I was raised outside of Chicago in a community that was very diverse. So my primary allegiance, the country that I consider my home, is this country. I'm a citizen of this country after all. On the other hand, I think that that one of the privileges of becoming a naturalized citizen in the second half of the 20th century is in some ways you don't have to leave your identity, your homeland behind, that you carry that identity with you. I think earlier immigrants who came to America, changed their names, they abandoned their food, their music, their songs, and some of them yearned and pined for the homeland, but they kept it quiet because the thrust was to become an American meant to adopt this American culture. Well, at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st century, I think American culture is no longer that sort of white bread wasp culture of the 1950s and prior generations. It's much more diverse than that. And so some of us who came as later immigrants have been able to a certain extent, to retain our sense of ethnic identity, cultural identity, and without having political allegiances to our homelands, can still consider ourselves Americans and Cuban, or Americans and Swedish, and Americans and Norwegian, or whatever. And that's an interesting place to be.
Well, you have visited Cuba, I know.
Mm-hmm.
What did you have to do to get there?
Oh, that was an interesting... There are a number of individuals who are allowed to go to Cuba as long as they have permission from both the U.S. government and the Cuban government. And those individuals include members of the press, scholars doing research, military people, so sort of the official types. And they're the exceptions to the embargo. Cuban nationals in this country are allowed to go back to visit relatives for personal reasons. So I could go back simply as a Cuban national who wanted to visit his great aunts and uncles. On the other hand, at the time, I was working at the Art Institute in Chicago, and we were doing we did a lecture series, a whole year's worth of programming on Cuba. Brought in scholars, gave presentations. I was doing research on Cuban art and culture, so I qualified as a scholar and a Cuban national, so I could go to Cuba in those two capacities. The other thing that we did was we formed a study group, had the Art Institute, an institution in this country, sponsor our trip to Cuba, and then we had comparable institutions in Cuba sponsor our trip from there. We had to ask for visas from the Cubans and permission to come, and once we had all that paperwork, it took about a year's worth of planning, basically sending paperwork back and forth between the Cuban interest section in Washington, D.C. and Chicago. And at the end of it, we had requested 14 days, and I think we were given 10 days ultimately to go to Cuba. And of course, much of our trip was prescribed for us. You will meet with this museum staff. You will meet with the Union of Artists and Writers. You will meet with these representatives, et cetera, et cetera. But then we were also given a lot of freedom to travel, to see parts of the island, to visit museums, to and of course to visit relatives, which is what I wanted to do. I wanted to go back to my hometown.
You know, Raphael, we're kind of ignoring the elephant in the corner, and that is the Cuban community in Florida, which, as you say, instead of dispersing through the country and becoming Americanized, has formed its own mini Havana.
Yes.
And has a tremendous amount of political clout,
Yes.
and exploited that anti-communist feeling at first. The rest of the country ran along with it wholeheartedly, but now even when I think the rest of the country is not so sure, that Cuban influence is so strong.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you say your parents were part of that generation,
Yeah.
but they did not stay there. They moved
That's
to
right.
Chicago.
That's right.
Can you give some perspective on the psychology of that from looking at your parents and other people? What is at stake for these people in being so adamantly anti-Castro to the expense of their own countrymen in some cases?
Yeah. Well, it's a very complicated community, and I sometimes I have a hard time identifying with its values, namely because I didn't grow up in it. One thing, I want to go back to something you said earlier, though. The Cubans, in general, have been much more mainstreamed than the majority of Latin Americans in this country. And there's a whole host of reasons. One of them is that that generation that arrived here had a very strong work ethic, had a very strong educational ethic, and a lot of them had education. I mean, the stories you hear among Cuban immigrants is, the doctor who went to flip burgers, the professionals who went to scrub floors to get their kids into schools, into the good schools and into the universities. And in that regard, the Cuban community has been much more successful at identifying with good old-fashioned American values. It's a very family-centered community, very where the community troubles me is the second half of your comment, where in fact it's a community that has come together around communism, around this single issue. And there is, in fact, very little democratic discourse in that community. Because that issue, communism or nothing, it's either democracy or nothing, that issue colors the entire conversation. So that's the part that really troubles me about this. And the other thing is that the community has, in fact, ghettoized to a certain extent. In Miami, there's another large portion of the Cuban community in New Jersey, and that community tends to be more diverse than obviously the Miamians. The Miamians, to a certain extent, have recreated a vision of Cuba with all the economic prosperity that the island lacks. They have the climate, they have Miami is very much like Cuba. It's 90 miles away, and yet what is missing there is that the diversity of opinion, political opinion, and so I often find when I go there that if you say anything positive about that revolution, anything positive about Cuba's socialist aims or its gains over the last 30 years, if you say a kind word about Fidel Castro, that you were immediately labeled, you were immediately dismissed, you are a red, you're a communist, and you might as well be stepping back into McCarthy's America. And I've heard more liberal Cubans describe that community there as the most right-wing, fascistic part of America, because of that lack of discourse and that lack of any gray between communism and democracy.
I am the gay talk show host, I guess. Do either of these communities, the one on the island or the one in Florida, or for that matter, Cubans, and it's more spread out, are there differing attitudes about gay people? You're not an expert, but I mean, from what you've seen.
Yeah. The other thing you have to remember about Cubans in general, whether they're here or there, is that it's a very Catholic society, a very Hispanic Latin culture, very macho culture. To a certain extent, it's a very sexist, misogynist culture, and it's a very homophobic culture. That is not to say that there aren't Cuban gays. There are, in both communities. One thing that I think Latins in general have a greater tolerance for sexual diversity and diverse orientations, and they have, and in a way that we don't experience even in this country. On the other hand, repression of open homosexuals is widespread in Latin America, both social ostracism and institutional repression. And Cuba's history of its treatment of gays is pretty sordid after the Cuban Revolution. I mean, it's a blot on, on the socialism on that island. Cubans in the 1960s and in the 70s or gay Cubans were, in fact, once they were targeted as such, they were sent to reorientation camps. I forget what, indoctrination camps or whatever, to have their sexuality changed, either beaten out of them or worked out of them. And pretty draconian, actually. And the AIDS community, once AIDS was identified on the island, people who were HIV positive were literally rounded up and put in Club Med-like resorts, gilded cages in a gilded cage of an island, and to be treated. And apparently the treatment was very good because they had the best of medical care, but they're at the expense of their personal liberties and their dignity as human beings. So it's a pretty...
Before we make Cuba sound so bad on those issues, I would say, first of all, the 60s were not all that great here. Your partner was sent for re-education here in the United States by his own parents.
That's right.
So it isn't always, and not only that, and I probably shouldn't say this, but I can say it because I am HIV positive. I often wonder if perhaps some sort of quarantine at just the right time might have been, it certainly would have saved some lives. And so, these issues can be debated on both sides.
That's right. I think that for me, the fundamental question is, was there ever a choice for individuals, whether here or there? And I think in both the instances you cited, there isn't any choice. And so it's a tough call.
And there's a difference between your parents sending you for re-education and the government, I think, maybe.
I don't know, have you read Reinaldo Arenas' autobiography? I forget what it's called.
The one that came out recently, something with 3 queens, or?
No, actually, it was a few years ago.
This is somebody else who was talking about Arenas.
That's right.
But
Now, this is a gay Cuban who came actually after the Mariel boat lift to the United States and wrote his autobiography. And he died of, he was HIV positive and eventually died, I think, in New York City. But one of the wonderful things that you sense in that book is that that sexual identity is very fluid in that particular culture, and that one isn't necessarily labeled as gay or as straight or as even bisexual in the culture, that there's a lot more variety in some ways and a lot of tolerance for varying sexual identities, in spite of Catholicism, in spite of this kind of machismo of the island. So I don't know what it's like to be Cuban and be gay because I've grown up in this country. So in some ways, my sexual identity derives from living and growing up in this culture in the last 3 decades of the 20th century. But it would be interesting to talk to Cubans on the island to see if it's comparable.
You're touching on a point I did want to bring up, and that is that cultures really are different. I discovered a video of Cuban drag queens, which I passed on to you, which was amazing, because I'm not all that big on drag queens, because I'm thinking of American drag queens. Now, these Cuban drag queens, getting up in drag was a form of standing up for gay rights and for the revolution as well. They saw it as, and they were running cantinas for the revolution and putting on drag shows because they were good communist supporters of the party. And I mean, it was a totally different, we were off in another world.
Yes.
And some of them were very good.
That's right.
They were doing their own numbers, which I was.
Well, I found that video interesting because precisely for the kind of that odd constellation of factors, drag queen, gay, pro-socialist, neighborhood support for drag queens, and socialism. but also there was a little bit of free enterprise. You remember that they took an old club and they restored it, and they were actually making money and putting it back into the community and all. But what I found interesting about that is that how much like drag culture, how universal drag culture is, even across, you know, the American-Cuban divide. I mean, I found that very interesting.
I also, this is a stereotype, of course, and you can smack me for it, but the passion of the Latin temperament, these were drag queens who were doing torchy, oh boy, they were suffering hard, you know.
Yes. Yes.
The ghost of my lover coming to the grave, and these were some pretty wild, crazy things.
Yes, yes. Well, you know, Latin Americans in general are very passionate about life, death, all of the big issues in life, and it's a romantic culture. I mean, it's a culture that is steeped in longing and yearning and spirituality. It has a particular flavor to it, and it's, you know, it's a very intense flavor. It's a little like Cuban cooking, Cuban cuisine. You know, it's a little bit of, you know, African food and Spanish food, and a little bit of French thrown in, and you know, but it's intense. The flavors are, you know, are intense.
That makes me think that, you know, you and I are churchgoers, and we sort of preach that gay and Christian can go together. That's never been a problem for Latins, from my
That's right.
feeling is that
That's
you
right.
can be a good homosexual and a good Catholic.
Yes. Yes. In fact,
it kind of is a nice thing to, it's a nice combination for.
there is an interesting thing, and maybe this is a feature of Catholic countries, and that is that that one is essentially born into a culture. One knows that one is born into. In fact, I often hear my parents talk about their village, their small town, and you have the sense that there were people there who were very odd, very strange, either because they were characters, you know, just idiosyncratic characters, or because they had mental problems, or because they had diverse sexual identities or whatever, or they had all kinds of problems. And yet there was a sense that they all belonged in this community, and no one ever questioned that they had souls, that they had human dignity, that they belonged, that they had a place there. In fact, my folks speak in some ways lovingly about people who I know we would ostracize in this society, we would keep at abeyance, we would not treat, because we wouldn't treat them as full citizens because they weren't cooperating in some ways. And I don't know if that's, it's one of those differences between Hobbes, Locke, you know, sort of our Nordic sensibilities, or sort of our utilitarian culture, and this Latin culture, which has very different philosophical roots, very different cultural roots.
May have something just to do with size. You know? Yeah, I was thinking about when I came back here 15 years ago, and then I lived here before that. The downtown area had characters.
Yeah.
Who kind of made your skin crawl, and they were a bit repulsive, but everybody went to their funeral, and they were kind of.
Right.
There was the paper boy, Big Jim.
Yeah.
Smoked a pipe and. You know, whatever, I'm not going to go into that because his relatives still live here, but I mean, he was really adored by a lot of people. Yeah. He couldn't have carried on too complicated a form of work, but he was great at being the paper boy, and he felt he was accepted, and he wasn't the only one. There were about 4 or 5 at that time, and now there just are not that many. They are, I don't know whether they're being institutionalized or giving medications or what they are, but I don't see them anymore.
Yeah, it's in some ways it's sort of like the richness of the social fabric has been lost, and you know, you mentioned the nickname this is one of the things I remember from growing up as a child in Cuba. Every kid had a nickname, whether that nickname was given to you by your family or you earned it at school, and that nickname identified you. It characterized you. And I mean, if you were born gordo, you know, a little chubster or fatty or whatever, I mean, that name would stick with you for the rest of your life. But those kind of endearments, essentially, or identifications, pinpointed your idiosyncrasies and pinpointed what made you different. And yet, the fact that it was reinforced by a community, I think is wonderful. And you're right, maybe it is a factor of size and a different sense of community, and one that I think we might be slipping from us in this society. And interestingly enough, I think the Cubans pride themselves in the fact that throughout the last 30 years of communism on the island, that they have been able to maintain their sense of community and their sense of identity without losing, the village, and without losing that community. And one of the things that they pride themselves in is preserving Cuban culture. And that's one of the greatest fears, of course, that if the United States comes in with its economic power, with its, with its Nike shoes and all of that stuff, that's going to be lost somehow. In fact, I have very good friends who are Puerto Ricans who visit Puerto Rico constantly, and that's one of the things that they feel Puerto Rico has lost since its Commonwealth status with the United States. And they often talk about how that Cuba still has what Puerto Rico has lost.
This is making me think, we talk a lot about gay community and about building community. And then sometimes you wonder what that really means. And I'm just thinking about the fact that this wave of gay activity in the last 3 or 4 years, if it's done nothing else, it's brought people into contact. So we have people in the gay movement that you may not be exactly fond of, or you may question the validity of their opinions or their intelligence, but you see them everywhere. They're part of your life. There is and I think that's a feeling that really should be fostered.
Yeah.
As opposed to all of us working for one thing or another.
And I think, one of the models that I've heard you talk about is this idea that the gay community is a multivalent community, that individuals aren't strictly defined by their gay identity. We don't have a gay ghetto in Missoula or in western Montana, and that's a good thing because it means that gay people are parts of a larger community, and their identities are based in multiple roles that they play and contribute to multiple aspects of the society as a whole. I like that model a lot, and in some ways I see myself as not strictly a gay person, not strictly as an academic, not strictly as a Cuban, and I don't want the issues of those communities to identify me completely, exclusively. For one thing, I don't think that the individual should be reduced to their affiliations with certain groups.
Well, and we all have parts of our personalities that are more important, I think.
That's right.
I mean, I collect LP records passionately, and I'd rather be talking about that than what we're talking about today, if I had a choice.
Yeah.
Rafael, one of the reasons I am so thrilled having you here today is kind of along those lines. I mean, I wanted to be the gay talk show host. We wanted to have some shows about HIV and AIDS and public health and rights and the church, but I'd also like to expand this show a bit where we can talk about anything, and it doesn't have to be gay related, or the gay thing can come in under the wire or whatever. And so I was thrilled that we were going not to talk about your partner, or not to talk about politics on the campus, but to talk about Cuba. And I should end it right there, but I have one more thing I want to. You know more about, well, in a sense, you're better acquainted with Spain. You've traveled more there. And as we were talking about this show, and I was thinking about it yesterday, I was thinking about Fernando Franco and
the dictator, Francisco Franco.
What am I saying? And Fidel. Finally, Franco had to die. Then all of a sudden, it just disappeared, and everything was okay. And what happened here?
Well, you forget the many little coups
well,
they found.
yes, and they had to accept the king, and he had to da-da-da-da-da. But they got there in short order. Do you think that should Fidel die in his sleep tonight, that something like that will happen?
Yes.
It's a.
Oh yeah, I have a bottle of champagne squirreled away for the day that Fidel dies, because good or bad, Fidel has been a major feature, a major accident in my life, and so I do think that when Fidel goes, that there will be mournings, there will be enormous celebrations, that Cubans all over the world will in fact uncork a bottle of champagne. without a doubt.
And vast numbers of people will wonder, what are we going to do now?
That's right.
Who are we going to hate? What are we going to be against? Who are
Yes,
we going to be
yes.
for?
That's right.
Raphael, thank you so much.
Thank you.
It's been a real pleasure.
My pleasure.